So, selfies, individual and social media. I think the way I want to treat this short talk is taking the selfie as a kind of case study for what we've been talking about over the last day and a half, about it being a kind of very concrete manifestation of the problems that we've been discussing in relation to the self and how the self presents itself in the world. And those of you that don't know, the selfie is taking a photo of yourself like that. That's the technical description of it. And actually, the selfie in that form of photography, the taking of a picture of yourself in that way, is really not something new or actually something radically interesting, actually, in that it has manifested itself throughout history in many different ways. Ever since photography was invented, there has been a desire to place the human, to place the face in photography. The appealing thing to us is our own faces and faces of other human beings. So the idea of focusing the self or the human being in photography isn't new and I don't see anything particularly wrong with that. And I think the kind of thing about this lecture is I'm going to talk about the wrong part of the selfie. So just to give you a kind of concrete example of this, here is apparently the first ever selfie, taken in 1839 by an amateur chemist and photography enthusiast from Philadelphia called Robert Cornelius. So the selfie really is actually not a phenomenally new thing. It was ever since photography was invented, it was there, and it was very much an expression of, I have created this brilliant thing, the photograph. I'm very excited about it, and I don't just want to have the photo of the table or something like that. I want the history to remember that it was me, myself, that took that photo. So there is the imposition of the importance of the self there, right from that beginning. An even better one is, here's the first ever group selfie. From 1920, it was a group of photographers called the Byron Company in Manhattan. Here is a picture of them taking that selfie. So you can see that, brilliant. You can see that there is a desire to, again, the photograph is this fantastic thing. Back then, obviously, it was far more momentous in that it went through such a large procedure to get the final image, that you almost kind of didn't want to waste it on a landscape or on an object. You wanted to put yourself, the creator, the creators in this sense, of the thing into the photograph. It was placing the self at the central importance of your expression, the expression being the photograph, and so the self being right at the focus of that. So while the selfie with modern technology at the click of a button on a mobile phone might be new in that it has found an easier expression with mobile phones, with instantaneous photography, the desire to put the self in photography, the desire to display the self to the public, to the social, is nothing new. And actually, I think it serves a very important purpose socially about the desire to put forward yourself out into the public. We've always had a desire to showcase ourselves to the world, whether that be through photography, but also, obviously, through art, through self-portraiture, which goes much further back from photography. The idea of having a concept of yourself, forward-facing self, that you want to present to the world, whether it be through photography or through art, is something that really instant cameras and now mobile phones kind of just made easier. It wasn't that they created actually necessarily any kind of new focus on the self. So I've just said that selfie is uninteresting and nothing new. The new thing about today's selfie and why it has this kind of special name is interesting. In fact, the word selfie, so my research on the internet tells me, was coined in 2002 by a very drunk Australian guy who lost his tooth at a party. And allegedly, when telling his friends how he managed to lose his tooth, he took a picture and said, oh, it was a selfie. Apparently that is the first use of the word. So, in keeping with the kind of theme of what we've been talking about and the line of thought that we've had about the sense of self throughout the last day and a half, I think I kind of want to almost park what I'm going to call the benign selfie, this very understandable, relatable thing that we do when we put ourselves in photographs. A lot of you will have done it, I do it a lot. Social, relationable thing of putting the self in photography, that's not necessarily anything new, but there is this new breed of selfie, of which I'm going to give you some examples of throughout the lecture, of where the self, the new self that we're talking about, this vulnerabilized, weakened, very introspective self, is manifesting itself in the expression of photography. The selfie today is this kind of, if I'm saying the other one is benign, maybe this one is the malign selfie, is the portrait of the Frankensteinial self, isolated from the social, antisocial fundamentally, and removed from any kind of, hostile to any kind of social interaction. And the ways that I'm kind of going to try and break that down is through three ways. I'm going to first look at the presentation of the self, what that actually physically looks like, what this new selfie does, what it looks like, the kind of traits it has, and then the political weight of that, how society is valuing this new form of self-expression, and then finally how the self values that form of self-expression, how the selfie is actually weighted by the individual taking it. So to start with the presentation of the self to the public, it was always previously, when you put your, stepped out into the world and faced the public out of your private sphere, it was always about looking your best, about understanding that society had certain values, certain norms, fashions, trends with which you either adhered to in looking your best and going to the interview dressed in a smart clothes, or taking an official photograph for your office job or whatever it was. Or you directly rebelled against it. But there was a very clear interaction with the social norms at that time. There was a very clear interaction of the presentation of the self with the social. There was a conversation going on here. A great example of this is family portraits, official family portraits, or official wedding photos, the staged presentation of the norm, which is the wedding or the family unit, to the world with your best clothes on, put in the certain position. And that was very much seen as an important thing, to show the self as a kind of, as something that was in conversation with the social. So it was in conversation and understanding of what was required of the self, so that you couldn't just put up, you couldn't have a family portrait that you would show your grandkids of you all looking awful. It had to be sort of momentous, and obviously that also played in the past to the fact that you couldn't have multiple photos and multiple goes. You often only got one or two, and it was sent off, and it was much more of a weightier, more important thing. Another good example is the celebrity autograph. So you would previously have the official photograph of the celebrity, which encompassed that celebrity's self, and you would ask for the autograph. Well, obviously now people have largely ditched that and take selfies with the celebrity on the red carpet, so you're actually completely breaking down that formal relationship there, and the kind of the formality of the celebrity being a self that is distinct from you lowly non-celebrity. So it was something that was, the self in the photograph was something that was posed, it was sent off and developed, it was an event in itself and a performance. I think that's the important thing. It was something that was not necessarily actually an expression of your direct self. It was something that you had cultivated to put forward out into the public realm. And there was a very clear difference between public persona and private life. So the performance of the self in the public sphere was a key factor. You didn't want to show your weaknesses, you didn't want to show your flaws. If you had something that you wanted to hide, that would be not marked in the event of taking a photograph or putting that public persona through. And obviously this has had limits throughout history. It's had limiting elements in the restriction of, for example, for women, of how you could display yourself to the public, or who was allowed to be part of those social norms. And that, to an extent, I'm generous to the selfie and the kind of almost the democratization of the photography in new technology, because it means that you can actually choose which way you want to put forward yourself to the public, and that's something that can be used as to a good, used to an interesting way. This idea of actually holding the public realm and holding the social as something that was quite weighty, that you wanted affirmation from, that you didn't want to put your best foot forward and your best photo forward to for any other thing other than you wanted people to like it. You wanted people to like you, you wanted a positive affirmation from society. Or on the other hand, you wanted to challenge. So with, you know, the kind of subculture that we've been talking about, or with punks or something, we wanted to actually directly challenge something. But it was about forming something new. It was about getting a reaction. It was about kind of having a conversation with the social, with the public sphere. Obviously, this has had its transgressions and rebellions as well. Throughout art and literature, there has been a breaking with the idea that the self, the inner self, the private self, should be something that's kept cloaked from public life, something that you shouldn't allow to splurge out. One of my favourite examples is Beckett's Not I, the play, in which it's just blackness but a mouth, and the mouth being the kind of font of the self, pours out the self in a kind of rebellion and also against its own will. The self is splurging out into the public realm in this very uncomfortable, embarrassing, wrong kind of way in some ways, and that is a challenge to the social. But also, you know, Beckett is saying this isn't something that's actually it's knowingly unacceptable. It's kind of word vomit almost in its performance. It is a rebellion. There is nothing inherently rebellious about the selfies that I'm going to show you. There's nothing, because they don't want to, these images don't serve to rebel against anything, because they don't serve to engage with anything. It's not about getting a reaction from the social anymore. The self has become very solipsistic and focused on actually it defining itself rather than it defining itself against something or in line with something, whether that be a positive or a negative social phenomenon. So let me get on to actually giving you an example of one of these things. Here we go. Instagram, if anyone doesn't know, Instagram is a fascinating piece of social media where it's all about putting up photos. And a really big trend, as I was looking through people's selfies, was not about necessarily looking your best, as I've said, and not about that, but about actually displaying in a very almost aggressive kind of way your flaws. So obviously, I'm fascinated with this woman because she just gives me so many great examples of it. The obvious display of the spot cream, you know, the defiant showing of this being my flaws and actually wanting to celebrate that, but with no conception of the fact that, you know, and no desire for people to say, well, you've got spot cream on, that's a bit gross. No kind of desire to interact with the social in that way. This is perhaps a better example of the same woman who is in the throes of some kind of huge sorrow or emotion, something which is inherently, I think, private and should be inherently private, perhaps. And that is displayed as the ultimate kind of expression of the, breaking down of the public and the private, of her inner self, her innermost emotions being publicly displayed. Interestingly, they often go along with a long caption like this one, and the long caption often has no relation to the photo. So in this case, the caption is completely unrelated to the photo itself. So you kind of have this celebration of weakness, this celebration of a kind of focus on the inner with no relation to the social. This next one's a bit rude. This is Lena Dunham, the US feminist, which as many of you will be familiar with. This is another very interesting form this kind of antisocial selfie has taken. She runs a lot of campaigns about body positivity and about the breaking down of the social norms about women. And what she's doing, attempting to do in this photograph, is to essentially say it doesn't matter that I'm not the perfect proportions of a model, I'm beautiful. But more than that, actually, if I'm just going to quote her, she said, "I spent so many years loving my body but thinking it wasn't lovable by others. Its sole purpose was to be fodder for jokes. I performed the insult so no one else could, but I don't regret any of it. That's my art and that was my truth." So the idea is very much about the displayal of this weakness, of this, it's actually a nice picture, but, you know, ugliness of the non-beautiful image, the weak self, is aggressively put forward as something that should be inherently good and actually doesn't need any social affirmation. So the whole idea is that in rejecting, as she argues, patriarchal society, you don't require any interaction from the social. And actually, as was mentioned in previous lectures, the interaction from the social serves to be hostile and something which undermines the sense of self. And then just finally, Kate Winslet, extremely self-obsessed celebrity. Her selfie, this selfie served to be in response to criticism she was getting for looking slightly old, apparently. And she said, "I know I have wrinkles on my skin, but today I want you to see beyond that. I want to embrace the real me, and I want you to embrace who you are, the way you are, and love yourself just the way you are." So there's this real obsession with realness, with vulnerability, with, you know, makeuplessness, with bearing it all in a way that actually doesn't invite any kind of conversation. So she's not saying, I want to talk about what the real me is. I want you to just see that this is what I say I am, and you can say what you are, and that has no interaction in the social. So it's deeply actually antisocial. There is no, you know, unlike Not I, the Beckett play, where there's an inherent danger in showing the self, because it is unpolished, because it is private. This is very much a kind of riskless interpretation of the self. It's the celebration of weakness and vulnerability, to no criticism, to no analysis. It's the kind of formalization of the private in some way and kind of desensitizing it. So I suppose the key question is, why has this come about? Why do people feel actually that it's socially acceptable to put up pictures of them in states of undress, not looking their best, or just rolled out of bed, or crying, or any kind of that vulnerable private self? And it's kind of what we consider to be the status of the self politically, I think. And as previously talked about in earlier sessions today, the selfie is a kind of, this selfie that I'm talking about, these bizarre, weird, ugly selfies, are, I think, monstrous products of the deauthorized, introspective, and kind of fundamentally antisocial self. They are, if you have a society which is telling people, and this is a kind of generational phenomenon to some extent, because it's a lot of young people engage in these kind of weird selfies, is if you're telling people that only they can define their selves, only they can decide what it is to be them, that regardless of truth or physical reality or anything that you can tangibly hold on to, that they define themselves, that their inner lives and their own interpretation of their inner lives is paramount, then you have a situation in which people feel comfortable with putting up public pictures of them which have no direct relation to the social or to the public. And this is kind of, this is identity politics. This is the kind of thing we've been criticising, the idea that you are only culpable to yourself, that your well-being is formed by your own sense of yourself, that your body image is something that you form yourself and without any public conversation, that you can choose what to be at any moment in time without any direct culpability or responsibility to the social or to the outer world. For example, just to take the example of what this means in terms of women, because it does tend to be women who do these kind of selfies, young women. You have this weird warping of the woman who puts up the makeupless selfie and says, I know that you think this is ugly, and actually it probably is, and it's not me at my best. But actually, I am deciding that it is beautiful. I'm wresting back that patriarchal, norm of beauty from you, and I don't need your approval or your disdain. It's something that just completely resides in my private head, in my private self sense of myself. And so that kind of attempt to empower is a complete deauthorization of the self and a kind of celebration of the vulnerable and the weak. So rather than empowering, you're actually completely weakening. Obviously, I'm slightly in danger here of celebrating the idea of having masks and having celebrating the idea of the polished self as something that you should kind of, without chink, put forward. And the Spike team can contest the fact that I do not put forward a polished version of myself most of the time in terms of my appearance. But it's this, the difference is in this defiant expression of not caring what the social thinks, of at all times, at defining yourself in direct opposition to the social, in direct opposition to any kind of relation with the other. And in fact, you can only express a like of the selfie, these monstrous selfies, if you do it in the correct way, which is without conversation, without challenge. You accept the premise in which it's put forward. And as well as this kind of narcissistic version of it, you also get the selfie expressed in very other weird ways. So this was something that hit the news recently, of people taking selfies at Grenfell Tower while it was still smoking. And in this woman's face is blurred, but in these photos you can see that there is a performance going on there of the self, and actually the self is completely there, physically, removed from what is happening. The idea that the monstrous idea that you could take a selfie of something, of a site where people have just died with sunglasses on, and the most important thing to you in that moment is the self, is the fact of how you look, and also more than that, the kind of proof that you were there, the kind of proof to yourself that the main importance in this photo is you there. And this also happened during the Westminster attack. This was actually taken during the attack. There it's not just, you could kind of argue that that was some kind of strange voyeurism in relationship to tourism or anything like that, a kind of public event. Maybe they didn't understand what was happening, although that seems unlikely. But I think it also, the ease with which these people feel that they can do something so self-obsessed and solipsistic at a moment of great kind of social upheaval is telling in the way in which we focus and way in which we weight the kind of idea of the self and the importance of it. This was the more famous example of a man with a selfie stick literally taking a selfie while someone was getting CPR. So these are not only a prioritisation of the self over important political and social events in this case. It's the idea that all that matters here is myself rather than the events taking place around me. So the idea that the social is so hostile and so unimportant in your sense of self, the public is so unimportant, and the public-facing thing is so unimportant, that all that matters in this case is the picture of you. And it also serves, interestingly, as a kind of the proof of the self. So not only could this person, as lots of other people did during these attacks or big events like this, is you get people taking their phones out and taking pictures as proof. The difference here is that it's taking that one step further, because it's not sufficient to just prove it by taking a picture on your phone that you were there. You actually have to place yourself into the photograph so that you can then later say, well, here's the proof that I was at Westminster. I was subject to the trauma of that event, and I should be party to the whatever the makeup for that is, and I need to be part of that conversation. This is like physical proof of it. And Susan Sontag on photography talks about this, where she says that photographs give people an imaginary possession of a past that is unreal. They help people to take possession of a space in which they are insecure. And she talks about that in photography's relationship to tourism, and about people feeling vulnerable in spaces that they don't own, and finding that, she says, the photograph gives them that kind of grounding. And in this sense, it's not only the photograph that gives the grounding, but it's the photograph of the self, the selfie, that kind of in a very tumultuous moment like Westminster, that you can ground yourself back into your solipsistic self, that is the thing that gives you solace, because it removes you from the social situation. Another kind of, well, this is the same thing really, is that selfies also, in line with this kind of dramatic, horrendous selfie, has removed the self so drastically from the social that you end up putting the self in danger. And so you have people doing things like this, which leads to death. And US researchers stated that 15 selfiers died in 2014. It rose to 39 in 2015 and 73 in the first 8 months of 2016. So more and more people are actually dying in the pursuit of a selfie. This is a particular affliction in India, where the death rate in India for selfies has been skyrocketing, so much that police in Mumbai have banned selfie spots, known areas of danger where people are flooding to take selfies and dying in the process in large numbers. So, I mean, you know, what's going on there? It's the complete removal of the self from the social, to the point at which you have no relation to the fact that you are in imminent danger. The same could be said about the Westminster attack. Imagine fighting the desire to survive with the desire to take a photograph. And so this kind of, I feel that I can't really overstate the complete dramatic removal and disavowal of the public in this expression of the self in this form of photography. And so it begs the question of why we selfie, why people do this, and where the kind of appreciation of the self comes from and what purpose it serves. Obviously, as I said at the beginning of the talk, photography is fascinating, and I think most people will admit to the fact that when you take a picture of yourself, it's fascinating to look at yourself. There is something deeply, intrinsically, humanly understandable about being fascinated in the pursuit of the inner and the self. But while previously that would take its form in some kind of expression, so whether it was portraiture, where brushstrokes and lighting and other kind of craft would form the self, this instantaneous, direct relation, almost 2D representation of the self takes precedence. And the mobile phone becomes a kind of mediator in a way between the inner self and the social, in the fact that it's only through the mobile phone, through the picture, that you can have any kind of affirmation of yourself and what it means to have a self. You know, people kind of ask the question, were you really, I went to this concert, well, were you really there if you didn't take a selfie? You kind of have to prove that you have life events through the continual reference back to the self. And of course, there is a kind of complexity here in that if you were to take this kind of logic that I'm putting up of the antisocial nature of this expression of the self to its final conclusion, well, nobody would put up selfies. There would be no need to express this image of the self, because you would just kind of deeply involve yourself in this solipsism and reject society in all ways, so that you wouldn't need to have the Twitter account or the Facebook to facilitate the putting up of the selfies. So I think perhaps in the discussion we can talk about what I think is a rather encouraging still desire to have some kind of relationship with social interaction, to still get a like for the selfie that you put up, no matter how monstrous it is, as I said. And perhaps this is because we have got a younger generation who is not only more preoccupied with themselves, but being told to be preoccupied with the pursuit of their self in direct distance from the social, in a very antisocial way. So I'd just like to kind of finish on Lena Dunham again, the woman that I love to hate, because she has so many great examples of what's wrong with society in many ways. And she has, rightly or wrongly, become a kind of mouthpiece for this very interesting and kind of tormentuous sense of self, because she has, through her own admission, gone through so many stages of a self and has now arrived in her 30s at the self that she loves, that is her truth, that is her real inner self. And she, in a piece that she was talking about her mother, who was a not very good artist, she said, "My mother invented the selfie. Sure, there were self-portraits before her, but she perfected the art of the vulnerable candid with no unclear purpose." So Dunham is saying that's what the selfie is. It's the vulnerable candid with no clear purpose. And I think that sense of having no clear purpose is the key thing about the selfie, in that the pursuit of the self, the inner, and the expression of that has no purpose, has decidedly no purpose, because it doesn't want to gain anything from the social. It doesn't ask anything of society. It doesn't actually ask anything of the person, because there is no aspiration in that. If you're putting forward the public display of your inner self is you at your weakest, your most vulnerable, your worst, with all your flaws, then you've set the bar pretty low. There's nothing that you need to kind of aspire to that. So in this monstrous and very, very strange expression of the self in the selfie, I think it's a kind of product, a Frankensteinian product of the self that has been told to seek isolation and has been told to go off into the wilderness of the mobile phone and do not interact with the social. And so in that way, you have the perfect case study of what happens when you assert that the only thing that's important to the self is the self's own relation and understanding of the self.